image comes to mind when you think about God's creation? Do you think big, like a forest, maybe stars or galaxies? What about weather events? Now, what about something small like a beetle or a butterfly? We invite you to think about God's creation from many different angles. Try thinking of yourself as a small insect pollinating a beautiful flower. How does that feel? And now think of yourself as a huge oak tree, giving shelter to birds and animals and shade to friends on a picnic. How cool is that? And that little journey is just a glimpse into the impetus for this video series, the feeling of interconnectedness with all other life forms on Mother Earth. We're calling this video series Connected in God's Creation, and we're exploring ways of responding to God's call to care for creation. We acknowledge the mess we have made and allowed to continue for far too long, and we need to be part of the solution. If you'd like to record your thoughts as you listen to this material, please feel free to pause the video and get something to take notes with. Welcome back. This series was created by Lutherans and Episcopalians in the Delaware and Maryland area who are eager to share the vision, the wisdom, and the call to action that is the Earth Charter. The Earth Charter was crafted by visionaries with input from thousands of individuals and organizations around the world almost 22 years ago. This is a picture of it on my kitchen counter. And while it is only 4 pages long, albeit very small font, it is huge in its intent. It was written for the collective we. It is a secular document, but it is in lockstep with the 10 Commandments, the Golden Rule, and all of Jesus Christ's teachings. And it has been endorsed by the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, the Episcopal Church, and many, many other religions around the world. The Earth Charter's goal is to inspire a sense of responsibility for all beings, regardless of their importance to humans, for creatures now, and importantly, in the future. The Earth Charter is intended for all individuals, organizations, both for-profit and non-profit, and governments. There's no one left out of its intentions. It offers a recipe for successful living on Mother Earth. It reminds humans that while we are not more important than trees or waterways or kangaroos or butterflies, we do have an outsized impact on other life forms. And our ways need to change if humans are going to exist for longer than just a few more generations. The Earth Charter has 61 objectives, which are grouped into 16 principles and further grouped into 4 pillars, which we will list now. Number 1, we must respect and care for all plants, animals, and people. Number 2, we must strive for ecological integrity. Number 3, we need social and economic justice. And number 4, we have an imperative to strive for democracy, nonviolence, and peace. This video will cover aspects of the 3rd pillar, social and economic justice. Please enjoy.
Hello, my name is Sue Linderman, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to share the time with you as together we explore racism and mass incarceration in America. The material for this class comes from part 4 of a 6-part class series that I researched and created entitled Racism in America, the History We Didn't Learn in School. I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware, graduating from Mount Pleasant Public High School before going on to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science at Mount Holyoke College. I'm a co-founder of the Westminster Peace and Justice Work Group in Wilmington that was formed in the spring of 2018 with the twin goals of combating violence in Wilmington and promoting racial justice. The work group is affiliated with a number of community organizations, including the Delaware Center for Justice, the Coalition to Dismantle the New Jim Crow, and Smart Justice Delaware, among many others. I grew up in a virtually all-white environment. Until I graduated from high school, the only Black person I knew was our mailman, Mr. Brown. Then 2 significant events occurred. My summer job that year, taking the first Delaware state census, had me going door to door and conversing with hundreds of people who didn't look like me. That fall, I found myself on a multiracial campus during the height of the Civil Rights Movement, 1963 to 1967. Those experiences launched me on a journey that continues to this day. I've had a lifelong interest in history and majored in political science history in college, yet it wasn't until 4 or 5 years ago that I discovered I was missing a significant portion of our country's history. In my experience, American history began with Christopher Columbus, then the Mayflower and the Pilgrims, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War and Reconstruction with those darn carpetbaggers, and then it picked up again sometime after World War II. It was the series of police shootings of unarmed Black men that galvanized me to develop a better understanding of how we got to where we are. What I learned is that much of the racial turmoil in our country today can be traced directly to elements of our history, even before the founding of the United States. Many of the racial stereotypes we hear or hold are a direct consequence of intentional public and economic policy and biased beliefs that have no grounding in genetics. One consequence of these policies, beginning with the arrival of the first Africans in the British colonies in 1619 and continuing to the present, is a criminal justice system that is racialized from beginning to end, every step along the way. So let's begin. As we look at the history of race and mass incarceration in our country, clearly phase 1 is the period of slavery, which began in 1640 when the colony of Massachusetts passed the first law declaring that Africans were chattel, they were property. And the institution of slavery became more deeply embedded in the colonies and the United States until the end of the Civil War in 1865. And that began what I would call phase 2 of mass incarceration, known as convict leasing. This came about as a result of the passage of laws known as Black Codes. These were laws that specifically targeted African Americans and enabled police to arrest and charge and incarcerate them. The offenses might be standing too close to a white woman, not stepping off the sidewalk when you are passing a white person going the other way, being out in the streets of a town or a city and not having available on your person documentation that proved that you were employed. And what would happen is that you would be arrested, tried by an all-white jury, convicted because the authorities were all the police and the Confederate leaders from the Civil War period. And then once incarcerated, your labor was in essence leased to commercial firms like mines and railroads and plantations, but compensation for your efforts went to the state. And so the southern states in particular found that huge proportions of their state revenue were coming from leasing convicts. But it wasn't just an economic issue. The presence of these convicts in striped uniforms or in chain gangs perpetuated the myth of the dangerous Black male. In any case, these mostly men were incarcerated and held under the control of the state. And that continued with full legal force until 1928, and then lasted even further, regardless of the fact that it had been declared unconstitutional. In fact, it still exists today as prisoners in penal institutions in the United States are put to work, but the compensation for their labor comes to the penal institution or the state. And now we come to what I would call phase 3, the current phase of mass incarceration and race, its intersection, driven by the war on drugs. So as we look at mass incarceration today, the United States is home to 5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the world's inmates. In 1972, there were about 200,000 Americans incarcerated. By 2017, that number had exploded by more than an order of magnitude to 2.3 million people. And today, 7 million people are either incarcerated or on probation or parole under the control of the criminal justice system in the United States. And in the course of this happening, there has been a disproportionate impact on people of color. Mass incarceration in the United States has emerged as a stunningly comprehensive and well-disguised system of racialized social control, strikingly similar to the days of Jim Crow, a system of social control unparalleled in human history. No other country in the world imprisons so many of its racial or ethnic minorities as does the United States. Imagine, if you will, if Germany were to do the same with its Jewish population today. Incarceration rates due to consequences of poverty, racial segregation, unequal educational opportunities, presumed realities of the drug market. The reality is that studies have shown that people of all colors use and sell drugs at remarkably similar rates. And yet, a hugely disproportionate number of Black people are incarcerated for that use. And importantly, in the 1960s, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, it became illegal to discriminate against people on the basis of race. But it is not illegal to discriminate against criminals. And so today, many of those discriminatory policies that were a function of race prior to the 1960s hold full sway today because they can be applied to criminals. Employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, denial of educational opportunity, denial of food stamps and other public benefits, exclusion from jury service. And so the data will lead us to ask the question, is mass incarceration a criminal justice issue, or is it a racial justice, civil rights issue? So what do we know about the people who are incarcerated? These statistics are from the census of 2010 because the 2020 census numbers have not yet been available for this level of analysis, but we expect that they would be remarkably similar. So out of every 100,000 people in the population, among 100,000 white people, 380 would be incarcerated. Among Latinos, 966. And among Blacks, out of every 100,000 people, 2,207 are incarcerated. What does that look like? I'm tempted to say that there'll be a quiz on this at the end of our class, but of course I can't actually hold a quiz. So you don't need to know all the specifics. But here is a pie chart of the roughly 2.3 million people who are currently incarcerated. More than half are held in state prisons. A little over 600,000 are held in local jails, and less than 250,000 in federal prisons and jails. So it goes to show that the predominant criminal justice system at work is at the state and local level in the United States. Interestingly, of that 2.3 million people, 450 people have been arrested for drug violations, 909,000 because of a violent crime. But bear in mind that these violent crimes, as they're defined, need not necessarily include violence. There are many drug crimes where no violence was involved, but they have been categorized as violent crimes so that the penalties are more severe than they would be if we were simply looking at the action or the transaction that occurred. Really stunningly, 530,000 people of this number are in prison awaiting trial. Not only have they not been convicted, they haven't even been tried. Some of them are held in jail because they are believed to be dangerous to the population, but the vast majority are being held because they cannot afford to pay their bail. So I would stop now and ask you to consider, as you look at this aspect of our history, what surprises you about this history? What surprises you about the current situation? So now we turn our attention to the war on drugs, which began in 1971 under the presidency of Richard Nixon. Some years later, his aide, John Ehrlichman, was interviewed and even wrote a few books about his time with the Nixon administration. And he pointed out that President Nixon saw that he had two enemies, the anti-war left and Blacks. And so President Nixon elected to use drug laws to address his confrontation with these two groups. And he did so by focusing on the drugs of choice of these two groups. The anti-war left was marijuana, and Blacks was heroin. And incredibly, during this time period, marijuana was categorized as a Schedule I drug, along with LSD and heroin, so that the penalties for the anti-war left drug marijuana smoking hippies would be subject to the same kind of draconian penalties for heroin and LSD use. During his administration, the Drug Enforcement Agency was created, and the government dramatically increased the size and presence of federal drug control agencies. The concept of mandatory sentencing was introduced, and the availability of no-knock warrants in violation of the Fourth Amendment took place. Interestingly, candidate Jimmy Carter ran on the idea of decriminalizing marijuana, but was not able to make that happen during his administration. Nevertheless, in 1982, President Reagan took office and expanded the war on drugs. During his administration, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 was enacted. This law differentiated between powder and crack cocaine. We said that people of all colors tend to use drugs at remarkably similar rates, but white people tended to use powder cocaine and Black people and poorer people crack cocaine because it was less expensive. This Drug Abuse Act introduced mandatory minimum sentences for federal drug crimes. Now, interestingly, there is no pharmacological difference between crack and powder cocaine, but the mandatory minimum sentences were applied with extreme prejudice. With possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine, if convicted, you would be sentenced to a 5-year minimum mandatory sentence. In order to receive the same sentence for powder cocaine use, you would have to have in your possession 500 grams of powder cocaine. And so a clear racial and economic bias in the drug laws. And in the context of mandatory minimum sentences, if charged with a federal crime, as more Black than white people were, the defendant would agree to a plea deal, a guilty plea, in return for not facing that mandatory minimum sentence, which contributed to the disproportionate number of African Americans incarcerated for drug crimes. Not to be outdone by the Republicans, when he was campaigning for president in 1992, Bill Clinton determined that he would not be seen as being soft on crime. He would not be one of those bleeding heart liberals that coddled Blacks and poor people. And so that attitude first showed up just prior to Super Tuesday, when he took part in a photo op at Stone Mountain, Georgia. Now we need to understand the importance of 1915. In 1915, the Ku Klux Klan had its second launch at Stone Mountain, Georgia, when William J. Simmons took 15 of his cohorts to the top of the mountain, built an altar of 16 boulders on which they placed the Holy Bible, an unsheathed sword, and then they erected a wooden cross and set it afire, declaring that the Klan was back. Virtually every year in the 20th century, up until 1991, the Ku Klux Klan used Stone Mountain, Georgia, as its site for Klan activities. In fact, they hosted the annual Labor Day Ku Klux Klan cross burning ceremony there every year until 1991. It was the cause for Martin Luther King saying in his I Have a Dream speech, "Let freedom ring from Stone Mountain in Georgia." And so as part of his campaign for the nomination prior to Super Tuesday, Bill Clinton met with 3 conservative, one might say racist Southern Democrats near Stone Mountain, and they were flanked by inmates from the local Stone Mountain Penitentiary. And it doesn't take a genius to see that the vast majority of those prisoners are Black. And so the message was clear that Bill Clinton would not be soft on crime and not soft on Black criminals. So during Clinton's administration in 1994, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act was passed by Congress. The famous 3 strikes, you're out. Life in prison without parole for 3 felony convictions, even though more than half of the people convicted under 3 strikes you're out had never committed a violent crime. The act also introduced 60 new death penalty offenses, and it provided supplemental funding for state prisons in the amount of $10 billion and $11 billion to state and local police to enforce the drug laws. Now, the police forces in the various cities and towns were busy. And so the question was how to get them to pay attention to these drug laws and enforce them and create the consequences that the administration was looking for. So in 1982, federal cash grants were made to state and local police organizations if they would make the enforcement of drug laws a priority over burglary and assault and murder and so forth. And they did. Then in 1984, Congress expanded the federal civil asset forfeiture law. And this is a law that says in the commission of a drug crime, the government has the right to seize property equal to the value of the drug deal being pursued. This had been in place for quite a while, and the states tended to have very constricted rules around the use of those assets that were forfeited, and the states could decide that they wanted to use the assets they gained for education or for reducing the tax burden on residents. And they were very clear that specific decisions needed to be made in the interest of states in utilizing the assets that were seized. But this federal law basically overrode the state laws. And if the federal and state law enforcement officers collaborated, then that meant that the state police forces could utilize the assets seized in whatever way the federal government thought was important. So they basically kept those assets that were seized for use by police departments. It resulted in burn grants that would help establish narcotics task forces. And then in the 90s, there were cash grants that were based on the number of drug arrests. So it was economically advantageous for state and local police departments to collaborate with the government on the enforcement of these laws. In the first year, 1984, there were $93.7 million in assets seized. In 14 years later, that number was $9.3 billion. And as a consequence, this resulted in 3.4 million orders of Pentagon war military equipment being delivered to state and local law enforcement agencies using the civil asset forfeiture funds. The collateral damage was huge. There was an assault on the Fourth Amendment, supplemented by a series of Supreme Court decisions that basically said the pretext could be used to search a person, search a vehicle, even though the Fourth Amendment clearly provided protections for individuals. The Supreme Court began chipping away at those protections and made it extraordinarily difficult for people to be held safe from search and seizure. It resulted in racial bias and stop and frisk because all you needed was a pretext, a traffic stop, a suspicious behavior, a hooded sweatshirt, a flat brim hat. These arrests disrupted social relationships and families. The assets resulted in the militarization of the police, and associated with that was the growing use of excessive force. And clearly, all of this did major damage in eroding the stated mission of police departments to protect and serve. So the questions for you to consider: what surprises you about this aspect of our history? And what about it seems most unjust to you? So as we look at mass incarceration in the United States today, we know that we have 5% of the world population, 25% of its inmates. The exponential growth in the number of inmates, disproportionate impact on people of color, and the explosion in life sentences without the possibility of parole. Those sentences have quadrupled in their imposition since 1984. And more than half of those people who have been sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole have never committed a violent crime. Even juveniles sentenced in this way are likely to die in jail. If you are convicted of a crime and sentenced to death, the law calls for certain legal resources to be at your disposal for appeals, for retrials. But if your sentence is life in prison without possibility of parole, there are no resources available for you to appeal or to hope to reverse a bad decision. This whole system is fed by probation and parole. There are more than 7 million people under the control of a correctional system in the United States at any given moment in time. More than half of them on probation, almost 1 million on parole. And the opportunities for rearrest because of a violation of probation or parole is huge. In the state of Delaware, on average, 75% of those people released from prison will be reincarcerated within 3 years. And the vast majority of them will not have committed another crime. They will be guilty of a violation of probation, failure to report for a meeting, failure to report an address change, even though they're having to sleep on somebody's couch until that person gets tired of hosting them and they have to find another place to live. Because the economics play into this. Back when this explosion in the number of people incarcerated in the US happened, gradually states began to realize that they simply could not afford to pay what it cost to house so many prisoners. And so the capitalist solution of for-profit prisons arose. In 1998, there were 5 for-profit prisons in the United States. By 2008, there were 100, and their profits had increased on average by 500%. Now, I think we all know how the profit margin and the profit motive works. You bring in a certain amount of money, then you have expenses, and the difference is the profit. And your performance is judged by the size of that profit. So think for a minute, if you're running a for-profit prison and you'll be judged on the amount of profit you produce, how much money are you willing to take away from that bottom line profit and invest in the rehabilitation of the prisoners that you're housing? And even more cynically, if you invest in their rehabilitation and they are successful in returning to life in the community, then they won't be coming back to stay in your prison again. What good is that? A lesser known piece, but no less devastating to the individuals involved, is the impact of cash bail and fines and fees. We've already talked about the fact that more than 500,000 people in the United States are in jail awaiting trial. As we said, there are a number who are considered a danger to the community, but the vast majority cannot make bail. And so in Delaware, 25% of those in jail are awaiting trial. If in the context of the women's prison, 40% of the women who are in jail are awaiting trial. They cannot make bail. Worse, fines and fees build up. And in many states, Delaware included, if you fall behind in paying a fine or a fee, then a warrant can be issued for your arrest. And when that warrant is issued, your driver's license is automatically suspended. So imagine you can't afford a $100 fine that has had $400 in fees added to it. And now your driver's license is invalid. And should you be picked up as you're driving to work, you're going to add more fines and fees and arrests to your record. It is an insane system. And there is work underway in Delaware and many other states to try to change this, to make it more rational. Today's criminal justice system features an incredible erosion of Fourth Amendment rights. Stop and frisk, no-knock warrants, search and seizure. The criminal justice system is racialized at every stage from beginning to end. Who is stopped? Of those stopped, who are arrested? Of those who are arrested, how severe are the charges? What are the bail conditions? Is bail even set? What legal representation is available to you? Are you apt to end up with a plea bargain because you can't afford to go to trial? Is your sentence going to be more severe because of the color of your skin? And what about your ability to appeal and the cost of legal representation to make that happen? A judge in Boston saw that so many Black people were being incarcerated, and he engaged Harvard University to do a study. They reviewed more than 1 million cases, and they found that 665 of every 100,000 Blacks was incarcerated versus 82 of every 100,000 whites. Blacks were 24% of the population, but they were 63% of the stop and frisk and searches. More Blacks were detained without bail, and their bail was set higher. Higher offenses were charged. They were more often referred to superior court, where the sentences would be more severe. And in fact, the average sentence for a Black person was 168 days longer than a white person for the same crime. Our criminal justice system is in desperate need of reform, all the way through at the federal, state, and local level. Action is underway, but more is needed. Become aware of initiatives in your state. Make your voice heard. Contact your representatives and get actively involved in helping people, individuals caught up in this horrific, unjust system. Help them find their ways to a new life. We who believe in the power of redemption, we are called to do this work. Let's do it.